Alright guys, welcome to 4.4. We got this, the last smile, the final stretch, however you guys want to call it. Last unit of the book. And yeah, this is pretty much it. This is where it all ends, where all the drama, all the tea that we've been leading up to with this whole China, Japan, BS. This is where it all comes down. So we need to lock in. So right now we're going to be going over 4.4a, which is called Japan in 1919 and its reaction to the Paris Peace Settlement. So it's basically just talking about how Japan fared after World War One. So just to recap from chapter 1.3, Japan was able to grow its merchant fleet. I think it was able to triple it during the First World War. And they were able to expand their political influence, making themselves look like a Western ally. They were able to gain a lot of territory during the First World War because all the Europeans were busy fighting on their own in Europe. So it's like this was all like, oh, this is like free real estate. And Japan was the main one keeping the Far East alive during that time. So this led to Japan eventually getting its position as a founding member in the League of Nations. And through this founding member position, they secured themselves two things. One, a position in the council, a permanent position in the council, and two, recognition as equals. However, they still thought this wasn't enough, and they demanded a race equality clause in the League's covenant. So Japan wanted it because they wanted to be assured that they would be equal to the white man in decision making, and they would be seen as less than just for being Asian. However, countries didn't give it because across the British Empire and even in America itself, there was a lot of racism towards minorities, and they felt like if they included a race equality clause in the covenant, they would have to give up these institutions that benefited the white man, and they felt like that was not going to happen. So it was rejected. However, Japan rejected to its rejection by basically saying, okay, so we're never going to be equal, like it's fine. So to add insult to injury, after the May 4th movement, the Paris Peace Conference looked over their decision to give Japan control over the Shandong province, and eventually decided, you know what, we're not going to give you that control, it belongs to China instead. So Japan was getting disrespected after disrespected, and then came the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922, and the Japanese government made concessions in their navy size and in their control over China, basically just to please the Western powers. However, sorry, I'm sweating a lot, guys. It's really hot. In Japan proper, people felt like this was like bending a knee to the white man, and they did not like this at all. They felt like Japan was being submissive and that they weren't really acting like a great power should. So this really got the Japanese people like fired up against their government. All right, so basically, Japan had a very westernized democratic system now. So it was about time that Japan just said, like, listen, we want to, like, obviously, like, the Meiji Restoration and all that. So the Meiji Restoration basically created, like, a structure of government that Japan didn't have before. They made a diet, which, no, it's not keto, it's not gluten-free. A diet is the National Assembly, the lower house of the Japanese parliament, which first sat in 1890. So in this case, it's like the House of Representatives here in America, or like a House of Deputies anywhere else in the world. So yeah, keep that in mind. And basically, it was the Diet, the Prime Minister, and the Emperor, and that was basically like Japan's democratic system. However, this democratic system, sorry, ended up failing because of corruption. So Japan was very corrupt. Like there was a lot of corruption going on behind the scenes. And a lot of people resented this. They were like, why is the money being distributed unevenly? Like, why are the politicians profiting so much when we have nothing? And also, Japan's government did not succeed at the Paris Peace Conference, and that caused a lot of resentment amongst the political, like, the people in Japan. They felt like their government was not representing them correctly, as they were still, they were not represented correctly, as they were not getting their wishes granted. And also, the willingness to make concessions at the Washington Naval Conference, this was like they didn't like this at all because it was like it was like bending a knee. Same thing that happened at the Paris Peace Conference. So those two are like kind of like hand in hand. They didn't like that their government was being so submissive when faced with foreigners, and they felt like that was making Japan look like the world's kicking bucket, which not really. And also there was a rise in military groups. So basically, Japan had a main army, like a main army externally, which was the Kwangtung Army. The Kwangtung Army was the Japanese units of the Japanese controlled areas of Manchuria to protect Japan's interest into like in the province. And basically, they were the ones who blew up the train for the Mukden incident and then gave Japan the pretext to invade China, Manchuria. And that was basically what happened. However, alongside the official Kwangtung Army and the Imperial Japanese Army, there were like societies like the Cherry Blossom Society that were violent military gangs who were posing a threat to government. Like the government was looking weak in front of them, and that was not like something that people wanted. People didn't want a government that couldn't stand up to gangs, obviously. And then Japan failed economically, and this led to the failure of democracy. So after the First World War, since they had so much output and very little people to buy it, so same thing we reviewed in 1.1 all the way at the beginning. Crazy how the book goes full circle. Just basically the saying of history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. Japan was facing a period of deflation, kind of like the Long Depression, after the First World War. And then that led to the 1920s not being too hot, but then people were like, okay, fine, whatever, we have the 1930s now. No, you don't. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, and that basically kicked off a whole worldwide depression. However, in Japan, the Japanese people were blaming their government. So by them blaming their government, this made that so that the people in Japan were like, okay, we don't want the government anymore. We don't like our government. And then this was because of the Great Depression, but also their deflation in the 1920s. So basically, those were the economic reasons why Japan didn't succeed as a democracy. And politically, they just were very corrupt. They were making concessions all the time, and they weren't able to keep up with other gangs that they should be able to put down because they're the official government. So now I can hear the gears turning in your little brain, and you're asking yourself, like, so if Japan wasn't a democracy, what were they now? So now Japan had fallen under a military dictatorship, and basically, this really impacted Japanese expansionism as this led to the facilitation of invasion of into Manchuria by the Kwangtung Army, which was the army that was able to blow up the train to justify the Mukden incident and then justify invading Manchuria in 1931. And then the democratic government, following the invasion of Manchuria, the democratic government was replaced by a national unity government, which was just a military dictator, kind of like Mussolini and Hitler and Francisco Franco in Spain. And this led then to two important parts. First, the anti-Comintern Pact with Germany in 1936. So I'm ranking them in order of importance more than in order of dates. So why was this more important? It's because this led to basically like Japan refuting communism, and they had the USSR right next to them. So that was kind of like a dangerous move, like very dangerous. And also you have like them aligning with Germany. They kind of became a part of the Rome-Berlin axis, and they were aligning with Hitler, who was becoming increasingly unpopular during the 1930s. Also, they withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. And why was this such a big impact? Well, simply because, like, we can't trust them anymore. Like, they turned against us. They're basically siding with Hitler now. And this made the Western powers be like, okay, what is this new Japan? We're not liking it. Like, they weren't liking this new Japan. And then after that, to add insult to injury, after the anti-Comintern Pact, Japan uses the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Marco Polo incident, to justify invading China a second time for the Second Sino-Japanese War of the 1937 to 1945. This was basically lasting as long as World War II lasted, and this led to a lot of like battles between Japan. Like China was taking on a non-aggressive role against Japan, as they were more worried about fighting the communists, as we reviewed before. However, this led to the Nanking Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking, which was basically when Japan committed atrocious war crimes against civilians in the Chinese capital of Nanking, and to assert their power over the region. And that was basically one of like the turning points of Japan becoming like an evil power in the 1930s. However, they were also, after signing the anti-Comintern Pact, they were so afraid that they were going to get invaded by the USSR. And also, since they were defying the Chinese communists by invading their land, They thought that the USSR was like literally after them. However, when Germany invaded the USSR in 1941 for World War II, they felt much more safer because the USSR was being weakened heavily by this. So they felt safer in the under like the envelope of Germany. Now we're finally at 4.4D, the very end of the book. Like literally, we're right there. We're at the. I can feel the end of the book. It's right there. So let's get through it fast, okay? Why would Japan get involved in the World War II? That's like bad dum-dum. So over the 1930s, Japan kept expanding. They kept taking land in China. They kept taking islands in the Pacific. Since they were so far away from the rest of the powers, they were like kind of felt immune. But then here we come. Us, America, the USA, we come in. And in 1940, before we got involved in the war, we imposed limited economic sanctions against Japan. Limited just means like they're very little. They're like, okay, like just don't do this. Like just don't. And just like we're just gonna sanction you a little bit. Like don't really like make us do more. However, then the U.S. was like, okay, they're not listening to us. So in 1941, once again, before we got involved into the war, we denied the Japanese people vital U.S. imports of oil. So this basically just made Japan like so much more mad at the USA. And then Japan continued to expand even though they were negotiating with the USA. So even though they were negotiating with the USA, oh yeah, we won't expand anymore. They kept expanding. Basically like how Hitler was working with appeasement. Now, what made the US turn on Japan so much and join the war? It was one of the saddest days in this country, and it was called Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor was what one would call a preemptive strike. Now, a preemptive strike is an attack designed to destroy an enemy's ability to respond. It is based on the assumption that the enemy itself is planning an imminent attack. So basically, what the preemptive strike basically says is that like your enemy is planning to attack you, you should stop them and stop their ability to respond to your attack. You should weaken them before they attack you. Now, it's already confirmed that the U.S. was planning to attack Japan. However, what Japan wanted to do with this preemptive strike in Pearl Harbor was to, like, first, weaken the U.S. Navy so they couldn't take their other things. Second, claim a lot of U.S. lives. And third, basically claim dominance over the Pacific. Now, successes. They killed a bunch of people. They killed so many Americans. They destroyed so many of our ships. And basically, like, they did pretty much decimate our Navy. However, our Pacific Fleet. However, the ships were sunk in shallow water. This meant they could be easily resurfaced and brought back together. And that's what a lot of American ships ended up doing. A lot of Americans ended up just taking the ships back up and using that to repair the damaged ships. So you really didn't do that much damage. And second of all, they didn't expect the U.S. to become so enraged with Pearl Harbor that they ended up declaring war on Japan. And that's where chapter 4 ends and the book ends, guys. Thank God we're done with this. So, remember, Japan involved in World War II. 1. U.S. sanctions 1940. 2. Oil sanctions 1941. 3. They didn't listen. They weren't listening, so then they attacked the USA, trying to assert dominance, and then the U.S. slapped them across the face and asserted their dominance because we are America and we are the best. Peace out. Okay, guys, anyways, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you guys become more educated. Hope this actually helped you guys. And yeah, I hope you guys actually learned from this video. Don't forget